All right, we're live. So over to you, Dustin and Alex.
Before we start, I'm just curious, who's joining in from Kazakhstan? Because I used to work there. I'm wondering if it's an old colleague or where I used to work. Does anyone know? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Raquel.
I don't think we've met. I came in August of 2018 to
No, okay.
Yeah.
I was there 2010 to 12 when UCL was still there. And Susan Schweitzer, familiar name. Okay, all right, we'll go ahead and start. Let me just stop sharing this. By the way, feel free to leave this Mentimeter window open because we'll use it for 2 more questions. So just let it hover in the background. It may just say, refresh or wait until we move it on. So don't worry. We'll go ahead and start. Okay, so once again, good morning to everyone, wherever you're joining us from. Let me just rearrange my windows because I see many, many screens. Okay. So again, thanks very much to Phil and Jolanta for inviting us. A brief overview. Alex, do you want to chime in on this one?
Sure. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Wonderful to see so many people joining from so many different places. This all began really with an email thread on the mailing list for the Association for Learning Technology about pre-sessional courses, EAP, so what kind of tools people could use. And Dustin suggested, why not try doing something truly dialogical? And that led to a kind of email back and forth between the two of us that we agreed might be worth sharing with the broader community. We are not experts on this topic, although Dustin is the host of a fantastic podcast series that you might want to look up after this presentation. This is an emerging practice. There's a lack of literature on the subject, so this is very much an invitation to a conversation. We're really interested in your experience as well. We just wanted to share a few ideas and reasons why we think it's a particularly valuable practice.
And just to let you know, this is going to be less than an hour now, workshop, an hour. We'll discuss the theory and practice of podcasting as pedagogy before we describe our own 2 kind of case studies or experiences that we've had. One was actually a first-year undergraduate course in the UK, and the other one was an in-sessional course in Mexico. But I won't speak for Alex, but I will speak for myself. You can use what we're going to tell you in pre-sessionals, whether it's 10, 15-week, a lot of pre-sessionals are year-round. Even back when I was teaching on pre-sessionals at Glasgow in 2012, they were year-round. So these could easily be applied back to that, or even pre-masters, any other kind of foundation programs that you may teach on. And as it is an emerging practice, we're keen to make space for you as well towards the end of the session, but all throughout the session too. And bear with us. We only rehearsed this morning due to strikes and various other things. We wanted to rest at the weekend, but we'll do well. So our backgrounds, as Phil and I think Jolanta mentioned, we're both doctoral students in education, undertaking professional doctorates. I'm currently doing mine at Glasgow. And I believe, Alex, you're at the IOE at UCL? Yeah, so currently I'm a Learning Innovation Officer in what's called the Learning Innovation Support Unit at the University of Glasgow. And I'm also an Associate Tutor in Education in the School of Education. I'm also a co-lead of one of the communities of practice at Glasgow, which is Decolonizing the Curriculum. Alex is currently head of the English Language Centre at University of Gloucestershire and has a background in EAP. And some of you know me, I have a background in EAP, but I moved on from EAP to learning development and then to online and blended course design pre-pandemic. And then obviously during the pandemic was doing that too. And Alex, did you want to say a bit about your research, I guess?
Sure, yeah. So my research interests are not necessarily based in so much in the UK, perhaps more in Mexico, where I have a bit of a history, and I'm particularly interested in one region within Mexico called Oaxaca, and language practices, language teaching practices, educational policy and assessment practice in that region.
Okay, and so the first question we have is really for you guys. There's a QR code there, which you should be able to see. I'm just gonna make my screen smaller. And if you want to just answer that question, you can either use the QR code or the chat. I put a link to the chat, and that will be the next question, which I probably need to move on. So let me just move that on. Okay, so what is a podcast? That's what you should see on your screen at the moment. And I'm going to share the Mentimeter kind of responses because we're going to hopefully see a wall of different responses. So what do you think a podcast is if you don't know? And even if you do know, say what it is. And also, perhaps if you listen to a podcast, what do you listen to? You can put that either in the chat, like your favorite podcast, or somewhere else. And the reason we're asking this question is because through my own practice at work over the years, I've noticed there's not always a shared understanding, and it depends on who listens to actual podcasts and who doesn't. So an audio recording dialogue, a radio show, a talk show. I would say talk shows, that's what first comes to mind to me. Audio storytelling, good. Serialized content, okay.
Great response here. Long form discussion between two interesting, hopefully people. I guess that's a very pressing comment at the moment.
Yeah, they do have to be interesting, otherwise they'll lose your attention, especially if you have ADHD or like me. So a video presentation, that's interesting. Perfect candidate to 24/7 news. Okay, nice quip. Informal chat where you share your thoughts. Audio video show available different shows, an audio file that you can listen to. Okay.
Quite a few comments about that kind of episodic nature of podcasts. It's quite interesting, the idea that it's a serial.
That's interesting. A one-directional audio channel and delivery.
There's one thing that's missing so far from these responses, which we could talk about in the next on our next slide.
Yeah, that's also interesting. A successor to talk radio, online audio discussion. Favorites, there's no such thing as a fish. Radio lab. Feel free to put yours in the chat as well. We'll save the chat if that's okay, and we can share that back. Audio show, one speaker. Okay. Practitioners thinking aloud about their field, but recording it as well. Yeah. Okay. I think that's good enough, Alex. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay. So going back to this, yeah, we would agree with a lot of the responses. So can you see my screen okay? Let me do that again. Sorry, my screen messed up. Spoken word audio, definitely. It is often a dialogue, and that can be a dialogue with the text. It can be a dialogue with another person or a couple of other people, maybe like a panel discussion, but smaller. And then sometimes I would say it's supplemented by a website. And I'll show you an example of that later. I haven't put it in my notes here, but it can be supplemented by a website where you have transcripts, references, linked to further reading resources, depending on the topic. So it's not just audio, it's actually much more than that.
Justin, another aspect of podcasting that I wonder whether it's really very relevant or not, but I think is fairly ubiquitous, is the fact that it's a free format. It's freely accessible and downloadable most of the time. I don't think.
No, I agree. Most of the time they are. There are now, I think, premium podcasts, but that's like with most content. There's always premium video or so on and so forth. So I have also heard of companies usually having their own internal podcasts, which are private in effect. But central, this is dialogue. There's a quote that you can maybe read. I'll just quickly read it to you as well. So to engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers, scholars, and critical thinkers to cross boundaries. The barriers that may or may not be erected by race, gender, class, professional standing, and a host of other differences. So that's from Bell Hooks, 1994. What she's saying here is dialogue is an act where we're listening and speaking with one another about potentially difficult issues. And that also can apply to students, and Bell Hooks would say it would apply to students. Alex is going to talk about that later, called Talking Back, I think. Right, Alex? Yeah. I haven't read that paper. I've read her books, but not that paper. And she also has a quote from an interview she had with Vietnamese Buddhist monk, and sorry about pronunciation, I haven't looked it up this morning, Thich Nhat Hanh. He teaches, in a true dialogue, both sides are willing to change. We have to appreciate the truth can be received from the outside of, not only within our own group. So I think for us as educators, what that means is we and students, we can't just work or situate ourselves in silos. We have to engage in dialogue with one another and get students to do that as well. And he goes on, we have to believe that by engaging in dialogue with the other person, we have the possibility of making change within ourselves that can become deeper. So there's a whole interview you can watch or listen to. It's between Bell Hooks and that Buddhist monk. They dialogue over the years with each other on kind of reflection and other things.
And I guess, Dustin, if it's okay to chip in, that seems particularly relevant to EAP in the sense that it's really quite a meaningless concept unless there is a dialogue with those outside of the academy. We need to be thinking about that, and perhaps outside of the Anglosphere as well. That seems perhaps like a useful reflection.
Yeah, exactly. No subject or subject area works in a bubble. They may think they do, but I think Ferreira would have something to say about that too as well. Dangerous thinking, perhaps. I don't know. So we're going to move to the pedagogies and theories before we go on to the actual practice, the examples. So Alex, over to you.
So we're going to talk about perhaps where we're coming from and why we feel that podcasting is a particularly powerful tool, just one tool of many tools that we should be using as educators within our practice. And those include figures such as Stuart Hall, Gramsci, Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and Gloria Anzaldúa.
First one, sorry, I was just looking at the chat. There was an interesting comment from someone about, let's see, the questions are mostly answered. The question, what could we do with the podcast format, not what it is? We could touch on that briefly or come back to it. Maybe. I would say podcast is audio only. It's an audio, it's a successor to the talk show, to the talk radio, like that we used to have. I wouldn't personally call it anything to do that has video. Some people would, if you want to be technical, some people would call it a podcast. Or kind of like Twitch. Some people use Twitch for gaming, streaming. That you could say that's a podcast, but it's not. It's very different. Anyway, we'll come back to that.
To come back to critical pedagogy, I think I personally see the three figures as being particularly relevant, perhaps, to critical pedagogy, obviously beginning with Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire has been mid-century, 20th century Brazil are quite dehumanizing pedagogies, which are designed in some ways to create a sense of internal colonization that remove legitimacy from speakers of indigenous languages, of minority dialects, and where the teacher is positioned as this superior figure. So he talks about a banking educational model where the teacher has the cultural capital, which is gently kind of deposited into the heads of each of her or his students.
Not gently at all.
Okay, perhaps more with a hammer and a nail. And he expands this alternative model of kind of problem posing where the educator problematizes an issue. And there is a creative communion between the students, between the learners, between the learning community, which includes the teacher, who should constantly be learning new things. And I then see kind of the next point on the continuum as being Bell Hooks, who extends Freire's critical pedagogy to encompass critical race theory and intersectional feminism. And she has a great essay called Talking Back. So her philosophy is perhaps best known by this kind of summarized in this book, Teaching to Transgress. But in her essay, Talking Back, she talks about the importance of encouraging students to speak truth to power and how that relates very specifically to her experience as a Black American woman. And the notion of, again, conferring legitimacy on the speech of students, which I think personally is really, really important, and something that I've seen time and again in my students who really don't feel that sense of legitimacy in both in rural Middle England, where I'm currently working, but also much more so in southern Mexico, in indigenous areas of southern Mexico. And finally, I wanted to mention one further figure, Gloria Anzaldúa, who speaks to the indigenous or borderlands experience of coloniality. So she's the lady on the person on the far right of that image, who's wearing a little hat and smiling. And she is a Chicana. So she's a woman of mixed indigenous heritage from the southern US, who has links to, who has this kind of complex identity because she was born in what is nominally the US, but she is an indigenous person, and she talks about the in her book Borderlands or La Frontera, which is a fantastic short read. It's got lots of really nice poems in it as well. She talks about the necessarily multimodal, intercultural, and translingual nature of communication. So she's got this this concept of hable para atrás, which literally translates as talking back, but it's actually an English loan phrase rendered in Mexicanized Spanish, hable para atrás, and it refers to that transgressive speech act of mixing languages, of translanguaging, of being creative with your language. Interculturality, the idea that we are all part of mixed, mingled cultures, and every interaction has an intercultural aspect, as well as the multimodality, the idea that perhaps the alphabetic academic writing that is prized in academia needs to diversify. It needs to embrace multimodality, because all language is necessarily embodied, whether that's in voice or in that alienating alphabetic script.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And so that's part of the theories, and there's some good quotes from Paulo Freire and Hooks. The next ones are, and I'll get through this very quickly so that we can address a question that's kind of come up in the chat, but Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall. I don't know if anyone has heard of either of these guys or the other two. If you have, just feel free to say in the chat. But why are these relevant to EAP teachers? So just a quick lesson on what hegemony and common sense. Hegemony, it's a form of ideological domination that represents an endless dynamic process of transaction, negotiation, and compromise that manifests between the ruling class, dominant groups, and the subordinate groups. That's from Jones, 2007, who talks about Antonio Gramsci. Really good intro to who he is, Antonio Gramsci. So for educators, especially if you're interested in policy, which affects practice directly, is how hegemony could be seen as a process by which certain ideas are made prominent in, for example, education. So what the government does for Tier 4 students, what the government does in terms of language testing, in terms of examination testing, whose tests are valid, so on and so forth. Common sense, over time, this kind of discourse that's enacted through hegemony becomes internalized in us. So internalized control forms through the influencing discourse and ways of thinking. So this internalized discourse, this internalized control through the discourse, ideological thinking, ultimately becomes what is called common sense. Okay, so again, through policy, which affects practice. And although politicians, they help sustain hegemonic modes of discourse, the ideas industry of policymakers and think tanks helps to manufacture, consent, and reproduce hegemonic discourse and ideology. And it keeps going further. Stuart Hall extends it through, and Antonio Gramsci also touched on it, media representation. So media representation, and podcasting is a part of media, right? As was talk radio, or as is talk radio. The dominant group can maintain power that can consist of, one, maintaining narratives that are distributed through media and legislation to garner public support for their interest and win culture power, to ease the gains of political power, or two, they can also use coercive tactics or tactics of persuasion through the discourse might fail. So why is it important for EAP or educators generally? It's important to understand and analyze the hegemonic mode of discourse and their origin. So some people talk about this critical media literacy, right? Media literacy generally. We often talk to our students about, you shouldn't plagiarize. It's like, well, okay, that's fine. But what about attribution and who's actually written what? Yeah. And what are the sources they're accessing? We don't often talk to them about that. Or if we do, you're in the minority. We don't often get them to analyze, for example, The Guardian and the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and the Independent, and put them on a gamut of, how believable are these papers? Students may be weaned, they may be taught not to use those kind of papers, but they have to know what they're saying, especially if they're going to do a master's in policy or in education or in something else that relates to media. Because although they shouldn't really use media sources as a source, how many of you get your students to use media sources as a hook to an essay? I'm sure a lot of you do, or you should be, because the hook isn't always going to come from literature. It's going to come from a statistic of some sort, which is reported by someone. I I'm just going to move on. So we'll get through this quickly and then we'll go on to our examples.
Some really great questions coming up in the chat. This is fantastic. But just to kind of mention some of the seismic global shifts really in assessment and teaching practice happening at the moment. You may be aware of the new CEFR guidelines, for example, the notion that we shouldn't just be focusing as applied linguists on encouraging students to develop their receptive and productive skills. So listening, reading, speaking, writing. We should also be thinking about interactive skills. So thinking about how to manage discussion, turn taking, back channeling, how to navigate a chat. We should also be thinking about mediation, which could be description, summarizing, translation. There's also an urgent need to address multimodality to make our writing more multimodal, which perhaps relates to the multiliteracies approach endorsed by the New London group. I won't go any further into that, but I'm sure some of you will be aware of that. There's a need for us to be embedding interculturality into our teaching. Dustin's also mentioned the importance of having augmentable resources. I don't know if that's something you'd like to comment on a bit further, Dustin.
Yeah, just very briefly, I'll probably address that when we come to my example, because I can talk about it more then. Let's see. Shall we move on to the next slide? Are we?
Well, perhaps, I mean, another really great aspect of using podcasting is that it can reduce screen time, both as a kind of input and as an output, which is great for mental health, potentially increase kind of face-to-face contact as well, encouraging group work or pair work. But perhaps one of the most immediate kind of concerns for many of us who are trying to address assessment concerns at the moment is the advent of ChatGPT or artificial intelligence, which threatens perhaps to spell out the end of the essay as an assessment tool. And podcasting, in many ways, is something that many of us are already very familiar with and which we can reach for as an easy alternative for the moment to essay writing if we are concerned that our students about our students' use of ChatGPT. That's in many ways a much bigger discussion that perhaps people might want to touch on at the end of this session. But that's another great reason for for considering using podcasting as an assessment tool.
Yeah.
Dustin.
And just to kind of cover this, from our practice, podcasting is an assessment tool, and that's the main focus of the session, but we can talk about others as well. Inherently, they're creative because you're getting students to create something with each other, usually in a small group of 3 or 4 people. They're dialogical or dialogic by nature as well, because they're talking to each other about a particular topic or problem, right? Posing a problem to them, having them answer it in those groups. They're critical as well, because through that dialogue, there is some criticality. I'm just going to use a quick example. Think of a presentation. A presentation is one way. It's a one-way message delivered by a group of students. It's also a one-way message delivered by a group of students who use one argument. They are not speaking with multiple voices. They're speaking with a voice. So if you're interested in decolonizing education, speaking with a singular voice is part of that Eurocentric way of knowing and being. One argument that's objective, right? One voice that's objective, I should say. Through a dialogue, a podcast, for example, they're going and taking into account what each other is saying, and they're making points, and they're not necessarily going to come to an agreement. That's not the point. It's not consensus or agreement. It's dialogic. Talking about a problem, suggesting solutions, arguing for them, against them, from their own point of view together.
If you don't mind me butting in, Dustin, it's also a great way of trying to ensure against the scripting of presentations. Very common practice among students, and something we should really be encouraging ourselves to move away from.
Presentations are always, whenever I taught EP, they were the bane. They were the bane because they took time. Students didn't like it, especially the shy ones, especially the ones who were not confident at speaking because they were put on a stage, right? No test, they can't be scripted. Perhaps they can, but they're not on a stage. So in that case, they're not scripted. And you can hear that they are.
Also, perhaps assessment criteria can be shaped to encourage fluidity and spontaneity. And I having assessed some student podcasts in the past, I think it's very, very obvious when something has been scripted, personally.
And if we think about the effective filter, it's automatically reduced, right? Maybe not to zero, but very low when they're out of the classroom doing it on their own time. So that's where proximity and space agnostic comes from. Proximity means they can do it anytime, anywhere, convenient to them. They don't have to show up at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning to give a presentation, after a weekend, for example. They can do it in the library. They can do it in their own home, maybe over dinner or something in a relaxed setting. Alex, do you want to quickly talk about the next few points, and then we'll...
Sure, yeah.
We're running out of time, I think.
We are. So it's also great for incorporating a formative aspect into your assessment, because there's a lot of drafting involved. It's more flexible, so students who have perhaps jobs, second jobs even, and or caring responsibilities, or perhaps different needs are catered for by this format. It can be more fair, perhaps, than presentations, because, again, it reduces that anxiety that is particularly present, perhaps, for EAL students, English as an additional language learners. It reduces that language anxiety as well as the test anxiety, because you can record whenever you feel comfortable recording. Authenticity, it's a more authentic format. We're familiar with podcasts. How many of us leave university and continue to read and write essays? Very few of us. So in that sense, there's a much greater degree of authenticity. I'm also personally quite interested in this concept of the black box test and the glass box test, the notion of transparency within testing and assessment, the idea that it's important for us to be transparent about the process and the product of an assessment. And glass box testing encourages this idea of creating an artifact which we can then be proud of and share with perhaps the general public. And that's obviously something that we'd be aiming to do with a podcast.
Okay, and just the next question. I need to stop sharing quickly and then so the next question, what's your experience of using podcasts? And this is an open question, so it could be either integrating it in to your learning and teaching, or actually podcasting, having them do a podcast. So that's the next question, which you should see in your Mentimeter, and I'll just copy the link and put it in the chat just in case. You can also answer in the chat if you wish. You don't have to answer on Mentimeter. So that's the next question. I realize I've shared the wrong screen. None? Okay. Input, output, not at all. A sense of listening created for students, and that was moderate. It's a small part of summative assessment per module and curriculum in education individuals, sometimes scripted. individual, so sometimes ends up scripted. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. Oh, that's interesting. Practice learning and listening and speaking skills with French, not for assessment, trying to get actually considered for them for modules. Professors have used it as a pre-learning activity. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll just quickly go back to the presentation. We'll share those results, by the way, so if you want to keep adding your results, you're welcome to. None. There's a lot of nones, which is good, mainly because we're hoping to touch on that here. So our examples, just quickly. The example from my own practice, when I was working at Lancaster University, there was a first-year undergraduate course in business, in a business school. And I say it like that because a lot of students on the pre-sessional courses tend to go to do business, right? They do marketing, accounting and finance, anything you can think of. This course was for all first-year undergraduates in the business school. We had about 400 students complete. It was optional, by the way. 400 students complete out of about 1,200. It was blended in delivery. It was really fully online because the main content was actually a podcast where we sat the lecturers down and we talked about different problems. There were about 6 different problems that we talked about. And I'll give you a link to the handbook in the chat that you can look at in your own time. Over 400 students completed. So podcast was a medium of not only content delivery, but assessment. And what I can say is we had a lot of students who were from China, a lot of students who were from the former Soviet Union, from various parts of Europe, Spain, especially, and elsewhere. And of all the ones I listened to, they did really well. They did really well because, and I think, and this is me inferring, it was a creative thing. They were asked to make something. They were asked to make something around a problem. And they were able to do it in their own time by a set deadline, of course. What I mean in their own time by a set deadline is they were able to perhaps re-record, stop the recording if they suddenly messed up. Yeah, which is similar to drafting an essay. You don't just submit the first draft, you redo it every now and then. And so, yeah, it was, I think overall, the podcast as a medium was successful as an assessment approach, given the flexibility it afforded to students. And again, I know most people teach pre-sessional, but these are first-year undergraduates. Some of those definitely were on the pre-sessional prior to entering that first year. So some of them, of course, weren't, but there was a huge range of students whose first language was not English. And it was really nice to hear them kind of engaging with each other through that kind of different medium. Alex.
So the course that I'm going to talk about is an EAP course that I was teaching at a Mexican public university in southern Mexico. And I had about 60 students, kind of B1 level, who attended that course. They were studying degrees in marine biology. They were final year students on the undergraduate program, and they had really a lot of difficulty with productive skills, listening skills, but particularly speaking. A relatively recent study had actually shown that students at this university left the university somehow after 5 years of compulsory English study with poorer speaking skills than when they entered, which I just think is worrying. It's very worrying. So this was something I was really keen to address through a course which addressed speaking skills. And the opportunity arose to focus on podcasting due to the advent of the pandemic, which provided logistical challenges for evaluation. It forced us into a remote learning situation in a context of digital poverty. So very poor connectivity in this region, very poor access to computers. 90% of our students did not have access to a computer. So quite a specific environment, educational context in some ways. And we began with a just listening activity. So we listened to an episode of Radiolab called Octomum, which is a really fun episode. They've actually produced a Radiolab Kids version of this podcast. So it was just a 5-minute excerpt, which is really easy for my students to understand. We used a specific template. I asked my students to break down what the podcast actually looked like, who was participating in it, look at the structural elements of the podcast as well as vocabulary, key vocabulary. We then did an extensive listening activity where students went away, selected their own podcast and took notes using the same templates and shared those with the rest of the class, found another student who was interested in a similar theme to them. And then they began to draft a 10-minute podcast episode, again, using the same templates, which I gave them feedback on, which was followed by the productive stage of the activity. This took place over a series of weeks, over 8 weeks. Over 8 weeks. And then I used finally an assessment. The assessment took place through a kind of conventional speaking rubric based on the IELTS exam, which I'd probably modify if I was going to do it again. But Dustin, if you fancy moving to, there we go. So that's an example, an exemplar that I offered to the students using this template. It's a very simple template. It's based on Peter Sharma from Oxford Brookes University. Peter Sharma produced a similar template, and I based my template on his template. And that's pretty much what I was hoping for students to produce, a breakdown of a podcast.
Thank you. So maybe, I guess, over to you guys now. The question is, how could you imagine using a podcast in a future course? Or if you want to try it and you're stuck, maybe you could even ask a question by unmuting yourself.
Hi guys, just to jump in here, I'll if we're heading over to questions and interaction now, so I'll stop the recording if that's okay, and everyone can freely contribute unmonitored. So just to say goodbye to anybody watching on YouTube now, and